Friday is right. I mean, what would you like to do more on a Friday than to be doing a recording of Popper 13?
Oh, I mean, that's just like living it up.
Living it up, give it a woo woo. At least we're doing it at the beginning of the weekend, not the end of the weekend.
That's true, terrible. And it's going to make our Friday nights very enjoyable, I think. Because
it will.
It's out of the way. Little reward, pat on the back afterwards. Should preempt it, but
I do like that, yeah. I even got myself a coffee for the experience.
This is one that needs a bit of coffee. It definitely needs some energy and some strength. Oh my gosh.
Yes.
How did you get on with this one, Ailbhe? The infamous Popper 13.
Well, I think the thing that always fascinates me about this one is the fact that you just cannot practice this for hours a day. I think maximum for me, I would do maybe 3 separate sets of 5 minutes practice a day. Like that's enough for me. And I mean, I think stretching is really important. I think this is one, if you spend too much time the wrong way, you can really give yourself an injury. So I think we need to stress that. My favourite stretch is where I'm turning my arm backwards like that, and I'm basically undoing. So obviously we're doing a lot of this weight down here. So if you imagine you're turning your hand complete opposite way, and then like your pinky is going up towards the ceiling. So you're undoing the feeling of everything that you're doing this study. I think it's really important to find all those wall stretches that we do.
Yeah.
I think that has to be part of your practice for this as well, or else, injury.
I also do one just like while I'm practicing, where I take my thumb and I just
me too.
Stretch it out. Give yourself a little massage on the thumb too. It's like take care of yourself.
All of those things, and I think I can't stress enough little and often. So again, this comes back to I think this would be the type of study that actually over 6 months it would be a lovely project to achieve, and just doing 1 line a day, and not trying to complete the study within a week.
Yes.
I think
it's
both
slow
of us.
Burn.
It is a slow burn
study for sure.
This is one that we both did play before, right?
Yeah.
So I think that does help a little bit, that we weren't just learning this in a week straight off the bat. Now I never actually played this in any class or a studio class or anything like that. But I think it's interesting. I suppose we should start at the very beginning and just talk about how we practice octaves.
And I think like huge disclaimer for this one. I mean, I think so if you've never practiced like lots of octaves, this is going to be like, I mean, it's very difficult, I think, for anyone who approaches it. But I think there's a whole thing, and this is one of the things I think that's great about this project we're doing, is just that, things can be hard and scary and beyond us, and it doesn't mean we can't try to approach them in a way that's going to lead to us getting stronger and better and more efficient at the cello. So I think just from a starting point on this one, I would, not to like put everyone down from the start, but if you sound really bad on this one in the beginning, it's kind of like part of the process, getting over the fact that it's just so nasty. So I think it's important to acknowledge that. Like, we all go through this when we're learning music, where at some point when we start, it really doesn't sound good or feel good, and it feels like we'll never get over that mountain. But you will, if you just keep persevering and, practice in the right way and take care of yourself and don't, as you're saying, very sensible to practice in little chunks, I think. Little
chunks is good. I think as well, when you are thinking about the very opening, if you haven't done a lot of octaves, I mean, when you're learning the cello, you always do octave scales and that kind of idea where we learn that. So you've probably all done a bit of octaves before. But this is quite a lot for a prolonged period of time. So I think we have come across the octaves in other studies that we've been looking at before. And I always come back to this, the Dvorak octave scale that we have. And actually, this is a great way to train yourself to do that well. So, do you want to, because Katie practices her double stops every single day, she is a pro, so we should definitely ask Katie how she approaches just double stops and octaves straight off the bat. first of all?
Sure, I'd be happy to give you a little explanation, but I will say that this week I didn't practice my double stops as much because I was getting so much practice on double stops in this. Usually I do all my scales, my
Nice.
thirds, sixths, fourths, and octaves. But anyway,
Fair.
okay, like basic structure to an octave. You always want to tune from the bottom note, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, and this one from the beginning is quite hard, right? Because we're starting in a very low position. So just, I mean, this is kind of an unusual one to start with, but I will because it's the first one in the piece. The way I find that is I sort of find where's going to be the balance point in my hand in this octave here, because it's quite a stretch, right? It's much more of a stretch than here. And I'd be looking for kind of where my second finger is on the D and finding it that way, but always tuning from the bottom note. Etc., etc.
Yeah.
So that I think is the first thing to know about octaves is you always want to tune from the bottom. Another thing that I think, and we'll I'm sure talk about this tons today, just when we're playing double stops, things that are really, really important I think for intonation and strength and just being able to actually play more than a bar of it is hand balance. So whether your weight, like what part of your hand is the weight in? Is it more in your third finger? Is it more in your thumb? Or is it kind of evenly distributed? And then also weight on each string. So if we're more weighted in the octaves on the higher pitch, it's going to be much harder for the intonation. It's always easier to tune if the lower octave is stronger, absolutely. I find.
I love all that idea, and just to add to what you said about the bottom, when I first started practicing octaves a lot, so we would talk about doing just the bottom note, kind of with the vague shape of what that is, and then the top note, and trying to ghost along at the bottom and see where your shaping is, just as a vague idea, but you're practicing that release that you'd have in any normal shift, so that with those two fingers you've already incorporated that. But then I also, sometimes when you are playing octaves and it's very overwhelming at the beginning, sometimes then I wouldn't listen to the bottom intently. So I'd put the two together and then I'd find myself listening to the top or whatever. So instead, I love thinking about the weight balance on the bow, just for practice, being 75% in the D string. So I can barely hear the top note at all. Just so I really am focusing on that. Just for practice, so that you're really training your ear to just be on the lower octave. And then when you've done all of those separate practices together, and you're thinking about the balance now, then you can go back to, but then actually that's 50-50 on both strings, but then you're listening, you're directing your ear already to the bottom. I think it's important.
Love all of that, what you just said. I mean, two things that really stuck out at me at your description there of the octave practice is, number one, I think a lot of times when we try to do octaves, the biggest thing is just that, you know, we have to break things down quite a lot in order for our bodies to digest it. So I love that, like doing the lower string, doing the upper string. And then as I demonstrated, before I try really doing the passage, I would probably do so playing each note, then playing the octave together. Things like that.
And the other favourite, so we're slurring over, so you really hear the connection between the two notes. Now some of mine weren't exact there, so in my actual practice I would have gone back and forward between the two, that to really make it exact, so I don't let myself away with anything over that slur. They're all good practice techniques. I love what you said.
Yeah, and then as just to highlight, so we're very much talking about how would you practice this, and then, you know, you've maybe been doing this for 2 minutes. It's like time to shake out your hand and don't get too tense, because I think when we're tired, what we tend to do is like press and use more strength, and that's just going to undo all your good work. And release. So especially as well, I think because things go on in the left hand, people often, I find when I'm teaching, you hear this kind of, you know, the bow is actually imitating the left hand.
Whereas actually the bow should just one pure sound, and the left hand is the one that does the release. So it's doing this release, but the bow has to be totally separate, just 100% doing its own job. And often when we're focusing on the left hand, we forget about that contact sound point, don't we?
Totally. Very good points.
Yeah.
You know, this one feels so much about the left hand, but it really is also about how the bow supports what you're doing. And I don't know, should we just work through it in order? Because there's tons in this to explore.
Tons to say.
So the first section, it does have a lot of repetition of patterns, right? I mean, so we have this first octave scale, that's E flat, and then up a tone, scale, and then, you know, there's later on come various variations, but with... Actually, I don't think the octave scale is ever in a different variation, except for maybe like 69 is sort of a little variation on that, and 60.
Yeah, or some of the times where they actually go back into the fourth. That's a really interesting, just after the scale, you know. A lot of that, really fascinating. Even bar 3. So we get up to our E flat. So for me, for the next note, this is where your excellent comment about balance comes in. I found it really fascinating that my balance for my octaves was, I don't know about you, but you talked about this arch shape that you do in your octaves, which I loved from before.
Yeah.
And so that's, the hand feels like an arch shape for the octaves. But then as soon as I went into this, I had to actually put more weight onto my thumb on the A string, or else that was never in tune. So I instantly had to adapt it. And the balance is decidedly different from how you are then going to end up with your... That kind of balance, you have to get back to your octave arch shaped balance. Now there's always a slight arch, but depending on what place we're playing, that's what I also found in line 3. So we've got, or going into our fourth, I felt like I had to almost rock into the D string and then back out again for when I get into the octave. So it's a slightly different balance shape in the middle for me. Now that might be to do with my finger and hand shape and all of that.
It's
things
so
to watch out for.
Yeah, it's so good you mentioned that, and I think what you've just said too at the end about there will be definite, like, I don't think there's probably anyone who can play this whole study in just sort of like one balanced hand position the whole time. There's always going to be shifts of weight. And I make a really clear point because I think sometimes students misunderstand that and they think it means like each finger is kind of doing its own thing. And it's not that at all. It's just a question of where is the center of the weight. Yeah. So bar 3. And then the similar passage in the following line where it goes up to the F and it's a minor version of that. I thought that like, oh, I've practiced this in bar 3, so I'll just kind of go for the same balance, but actually it's quite different just because it's minor for my hand, you know? So, you know, it's kind of, we always look for patterns, right, when we learn this stuff to learn it quickly, but it's also sort of registering those differences of, oh, this pattern comes back, but it is more physically demanding this time, and I need to really, really put my attention on, you know, for me it's that minor third. Or,
So I love that, and I also, as you say, you're talking about the major and minor, I have open and closed hand position written in many places across this, so that I immediately know the first line goes to an open position and then a closed position for the next one, then an open. And then the next time it's closed, open, closed. There's a lot going on there, but then my other thing that I was fascinated with was the change. How do you connect yourself? Have you registered that you need to actually shift a minor third backwards to get, because often you'll hear people play this study and just the start of the next line isn't very precise. A classic case of that is the end of, so bar 8 into bar 9, where you have So here I actually measured my second finger going back. So how far do we get from that D flat, which is a C sharp, you know, to a B? It's a tone. So that idea of it's a really fascinating harmonic change.
It's a great harmony that just
Yeah,
hearing
it's
it in
cool, isn't it?
isolation. There's some very cool harmonies in this one.
I know, Popper did well for creating a carnage study. But
Well-
that you need to work that out, or else your ear just won't naturally know where that's going to be. So it's kind of a guessing game unless you physically said, second finger down a tone, thumb comes down a minor third. And then we know. Then you can practice that back and forth. It's different, cool, we have it. Not an issue when you get to it.
Totally. I feel too, just to add to what you're saying, I find that a lot of times, and this might be totally personal for me, but if I haven't really measured out in that sort of way you're describing where I'm going, it's it can be a huge source of tension actually for the left hand, because you're like, oh, I gotta get there. I think, those are things to question yourself to anyone who's learning this, is sort of like, when you feel tense, is it because you're not actually you don't have a plan in mind of, what that interval you're shifting is, or a way of finding it.
Exactly. And then the release is completely left by the by, because you're like, I have to just like get there. I kind of know where that place is in the cello, so I'm going for it, rather than I'm just physically walking to the next step, which is what we want, right? I love it.
Yes. Easier said than done, though. In the heat of the
exactly.
moment.
I know, when your hand suddenly, halfway through the second page, and your hand is like, I'm done, thanks very much, I'm out of here. I was only going to say that, my usual Ailbhe tactic, which is time is money, don't play through the study, too many repetitive things in here. This was one of the only times I broke my rule. And I didn't do it every day, but I did play through it a few times, just because you do need to practice your stamina in this one. You do.
Oh, yeah.
And you need to get used to that feeling. Now, I think we're quite strong in the thumb at the moment, what with all these Popper studies we're doing. So that helps. We've got an extra little bit of juice, a little bit still in the accelerator for ourselves.
Yeah.
So if you're not practicing Popper every single day of an entire year, you're going to have to work this up.
Oh, yeah.
Without a doubt.
Sure.
But what were you going to say?
Oh, well, that was a very good point, what you said. I was just going to go back to talking about octaves and how it's funny how things like, for me, bar 15, so that's like the first time in the study where the octaves are sort of divided over the string rather than being played as a double stop.
Yeah.
And for me, actually, that's the thing, like, it's good to practice all of these versions of octaves, because I actually find the coordination of that, something about this that's happening in the bow, confuses the left hand. So I had to really, really, and I think that, it's so much about thumb position, this study, but it's also about how the bow affects those things and stuff. So for me, it's been really enlightening to just, like, really focus on those things, to say, oh, the reason this is harder, it's not because it's any harder than the rest of it for the left hand. It's all because the bow is doing something different. So.
It's very important to actually coordinate where you actually move, because I think some people then think, because the bow's not balanced, that we can kind of do this skatery type of thing in the left hand. And that is uninvited to the party.
No, nowhere allowed. You're this one.
I love it.
What about this nasty passage at 27 and 28? How did you practice
I love that. I think the problem here is that people don't really listen to the intervals and the tune. I think when they get here, they go for the pattern, and then they might end up it's somewhere like, I know where I should be. It's the Hawaii version of that was like what Erin said. I love it.
I remember.
It was very good. So here for me, I had to get a different for my finger size. So for the 2 and 3, I really need a good bit of weight on top there. But I almost had to, see the way my elbow is moving forward, I had to rotate around that wrist and area in order to get the right weight balance and tuning there. If I kept it here like this, I found that it just wasn't right. So I had to use a little bit of this for me, so then... And the same kind of idea. I mean, obviously that wasn't perfect, but...
No, it was great. It was really impressive.
Thank you. But that was unusual for me because obviously I could create the same thing like this without changing my hand.
Yeah.
Right? So I could do that, but the weight balance didn't come as easily to me as when I had just rotated a little bit around from where I was in the previous octave bit. Mm-hmm. So, but just by doing this a little bit and having a bit more of a perpendicular feel for all of that, that really kept the weight in the right way. And then I also really had to think about this. Now, I didn't do the release very well there, but that was for me to tune that, to make sure that that bottom, I'm zoning in there to make sure that all my chromatics are really pitchy. And I mean good pitchy, not bad
good
pitchy.
Accurate pitchy. Yeah, and I think you've highlighted a good point there. That, yes. There's so many ways to break down this passage, and I kind of was like, this is where like our creativity as artists comes into play, because it's like all of the ways you could possibly think to practice this, practice it. So, I practiced just these fifths, just these sixths,
Nice.
and then just the 2 and 3, and that's really good for the hand balance because you can see what works. Then I practiced just the kind of octaves that are highlighted. If you look at, like, for example, the bottom note of the first double stop and then the top note of the second double stop. And
That would have been great.
It's good just to sort of, like, look at the passage while you're doing that, because it's like a measurement thing,
Yeah.
So, all of that stuff, of course, stoppy-starty, because of the long slur.
Of course you did the stoppy-starty.
Of course.
Never comes to mind. Tell me this, with this section, I had something really interesting to say there, and I can't remember what it was. Oh yeah, it was the bow.
Yes.
So, did you have any thoughts about the bow here? Because for me, I had to actually have a lighter bow than I would have expected for it to just...
In this sixth thing? It's interesting. I didn't notice it so much there, but you're probably right. I'll tell you where I noticed, going into the next section, I noticed the bow weight thing was like totally weird than what I'd usually expect.
Yeah, I know.
So like, I think it's because of the like trem. I wasn't exactly doing these measured. I don't know if you were. But something about getting that to speak, it kind of like, we just talked about these rules of double stops and like more weight on the lower string, and it's totally the opposite here, right? Because the tune is on the top.
I know. So you do have to actually almost 75% it up on the A string for it to be nice.
Yeah. And still, I think it has to be lighter than I would play the double stops at the opening, just to kind of get that filigree sound.
I think you're dead right. And I also found, because I did practice it measured originally, where I did... So like 1, 2... at that speed originally. I should have practiced slower so it was a bit more rhythmic, but...
That sounded pretty impressive too.
Well, thank you. But I think what really fascinated me about that whole passage was then when we're there, like getting the coordination of it's really a brain melt. So I think actually if I had loads of time on this, I would probably do 2, 3. Break it up into half bows. Because then you're thinking about the intervals become different with the end of the tremolo actually. So see what I mean? Like some of them are fourths in the end then where it's a different shift actually that you're practicing. So I think you really need to slow that down, because later it is marked as hemi, demi, semi-quavers, right? In bar 72, 73, 74 and 75.
Yeah.
So
Good point.
Then I went to tremolo there. Now, I think when you're at the pace that we're going to be playing this piece, it all kind of sounds like tremolo anyway. Mm-hmm. But there's no harm in just really slowing it down for ourselves, because it's quite intense.
It's a great... I mean, I think you're dead right about how to practice this and everything. I mean, the other thing I noticed, because I did do more measured practice when I was doing it slower, but just in the past kind of day or two when I was trying to get this section a little bit more fluent, I noticed this thing, and Popper's so genius to write these actually measured, is that, this middle section becomes somewhat less difficult if you're not really trying to play it very connected. So, if you're kind of giving yourself that time, it's much harder to play it, like, as written.
Exactly.
So, I guess...
Well done, Popper.
Yeah, I know. He's always... You can always count on him to, like, throw in a few extra challenges to make it, like, really, really sophisticatedly difficult. But
which is why it's fabulous for playing outside of Popper Etudes, right?
I was going to say, though, speaking of sophistication, I think the thing is, too, I found, particularly in this middle section, that thinking about, like, what is this music... What is the character? Like, what do we want to sound like here? I mean, it's so important, right? Because even though we might practice it really slowly and measured, we want the music to be quite light and flowing and easy sounding.
Yeah, like, I kind of thought it was like a music box.
Yeah, kind of innocent, actually.
Or even like, like the mandolin, when people are playing like...
Yeah. I know. It's ironic, really, because we're all like, dying, like swans with our little feet under the water, going crazy.
Well, actually, I think even thinking about the opening, we hear a lot of people playing, and like you would play a scale, but actually, I'll play it in tune later, hopefully. But, so like having just a little bit of a longer phrase within this, once you've gone through all of the, slow practice, we need to bring it back there. Yeah.
You definitely can't skip the slow practice, but maybe after a day of doing a lot of that, then you kind of try it for that gestural feeling. And I think the gesture of it can really, really help the release as well.
Yeah, I think so.
I'm thinking so much about that in order to get through it, because especially once I get tired, I'm like, okay, think of the big line.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I think it's important to remember that by the time we get to like around 43, 44, 45, by the time we get to this, our hand we're really tired by the time we get there, and that's a lot of weight to have to still pull out in order to get the tuning. And we know both parts of the thumb have to be down equally there for that to be in tune. So try as best as you can to think about the sinking motion rather than pressing when we get there, because we've a long way to go yet.
I also think that, I guess here I'm all the way down, but I do think about this sometimes in thumb position, especially when you have something exhausting like this, is like, I think a lot of times we think like the string has to be down, like literally like pressed on the fingerboard, and actually I think particularly for something like this that's sort of more an effect of the sound, I'm just touching the string to the fingerboard with my thumb, but it's not like I'm really weighing it down, because that's, I think in general that's probably not the best practice to approach double stops, but this is like a special circumstance with your thumb.
And
that
the thing is, we always want that. Yeah, we always want just as much for this as we need for the sound to work. What did you think of that ending segment where it suddenly does change into the horn calls?
Yeah, I mean, the end is interesting, because it's sort of like we have the beginning section, then we have the middle section, and then the last section sort of like hybrid version. Like, we're going to use all the techniques now.
Yeah. In a very small space of time. It's such a cool bit, isn't it? that just sounds like a horn call to me.
It is. It's very kind of pastoral then. I think that passage is, again, it's all about anticipation. So there's a lot of quick changes, right, in terms of hand balance and also fingerings, you know? It's not just like, in some ways when you're just playing octaves, it's less like taxing on your brain. Yeah, brain melty. Here, it's a little brain, it can be a little brain melty, but I think practice it, when you practice slowly, like when I practice slowly, I try to practice the anticipation as much as I can. So it's like you're practicing in that sense of like, as you're playing one thing, your hand is already preparing for the next. But that reminds me of this thing Starker used to say about double stop. So like, you actually always want to have a note that's sort of linking. So when I'm crossing from ear to ear, it's not that the bow suddenly moves, but I'm sort of connecting the in common string, as it were. So like that passage we were just talking about, I mean, totally. Like, yes, it's anticipation, but I'm really feeling the connection between that note. So it's almost like a pivot point in a way.
That's great. Yeah, I love that. Very interesting trying to time that. Yeah. The actual. So when's it happening? It's actually happening a split second after you go for it. So then you have to do. But.
Yeah.
It's really funny to try and think about where the sound is going to happen, and then pits at that time. So you people need to work that out. Yeah, and then the end is just your a hoolie, right? Because we're back in first position.
Woohoo! We're done. It's definitely exalting, ecstatic.
Oh my god! Oh my god! The happiness. I feel like we're going to feel it right now.
The heroic key of E flat major. All right. Who's first then?
I don't know. Who's first?
Shall I go for it? I think you did go first on this one. Okay.
You go for it.
Wish
Let's
me
hear
luck.
it. Woo-woo. Have fun. Woo woo.
Thanks.
I'm like, yeah, Katie practices them every day. She just knows how it goes. God. She knows.
Thank you. Do you know what? It's kind of funny the sort of hormones that are in your body when you're performing this, because it's you know, it's exhausting practicing it, but I was kind of like powering through because of, and man, when you get to the end, you're like, oh, I've survived. Epic! Oh my gosh! That ending, right? Isn't it just like, oh, I survived! I climbed the mountain! Oh my god.
It's so
super well done. Do you
Thank
know?
you. Oh, man.
It just goes to show. I say this every time, but it's music. It's music, this, you know? I mean, we can look at this like a super hard study, but it's kind of enthralling to play, isn't it? Like,
it is. Like, in a very funny, like, you're kind of like, okay, yeah, hands getting a bit tired, need to kind of like flow through this bit to get to a place where I'm comfy.
Yeah.
It's, oh hey, we deserved our Friday night celebrations after doing this. I love it.
I will say, what a way to end a week. Wow, go us. And
Yay!
to anyone who's trying this, just be kind to yourself, because it's definitely an uphill journey.
It is that, so. But also there's no practice on this that will ever be wasted. This is all thumb strengthening. So even if you try this one for a couple of weeks and then leave it alone for a while and then come back to it in a couple of months and then another couple of months, every time you chip a bit off, I think everyone definitely looks at this with apprehension at the start, but it gets easier.
Yeah.
It does. So stick with it and you'll
I think we both demonstrated. It's very, very satisfying when you can actually play it.
It is, yeah.
Anyway, go us.
I love it.
Done.
Yay!
Woohoo!
Yay!
Woohoo! See you next time.
See you next time.
Bye.